essentially those for whom life in the community was relatively meaningless as compared to life in hospital, didn't survive in the community following discharge. And my students and I are looking at a whole number of other areas inspired by Fay's way of life research. One of the key features of personal construct psychology is, of course, that it can be used to explore not only the construing of the client or research participant, but also that of the clinician or researcher. Such a reflexive application of Kelly's theory is evident in Fay's exploration of the threat experienced by scientists when their preferred models are challenged. There's now a substantial body of work that indicates that the preferred therapeutic models of both clients and clinicians reflect their basic philosophical beliefs, or what my colleagues and I have termed their personal styles. It would follow that if a therapist's or scientist's preferred model is challenged, also being challenged are a whole set of fundamental assumptions of the world. Such a challenge to core structures will be experienced as a threat. For the therapist or scientist, then, their preferred model may often be regarded as just as much their way of life as is the client's symptom for him or her. For Fay, personal construct psychology was certainly her way of life, and her life's work can be viewed in terms of aggressive dilation of PCP, applying it to an ever-increasing range of elements, as is apparent from a glance at the contents of the International Handbook of Personal Construct Psychology, which she edited. Her own applications of Kelly's theory included using it to understand the construing of subjects as varied as Margaret Thatcher, plants, and, poignantly, cancer cells. Her commitment and refusal to brook any challenges to the theory to which she had devoted her life sometimes led her construing to be viewed as bordering on the preemptive. However, she was not unwilling to reconstrue or to admit that she'd been wrong. One example is her view of the grid test that she and Don Bannister developed as a diagnostic instrument for schizophrenic thought disorder. Looking back on which, she wrote that, "I'm not proud of having used the repertory grid in that nomothetic way, and would not now do such work." I have some sympathy with this view, and with her embarrassment at what could have been seen as essentially a collusion with a traditional psychiatric nosological approach. However, I do also consider that the research on which the Bannister-Francella grid test was based was of considerable importance in demonstrating that the predicament of the person diagnosed as thought disorder schizophrenic could be explained in terms of the same processes of construing as are apparent in anyone else. By essentially showing sociality and speaking the language of the psychiatric establishment, Bannister and Francella were able to bring this perspective, and PCP more generally, to the attention of a whole generation of clinicians. Personal construct psychologists, including myself, still experience similar dilemmas concerning whether to compromise in their use of language in order to obtain a more mainstream audience for their work. Another topic on which Fay appeared to show some reconstruing is constructivism. In her book on George Kelly, she wrote that, "I see no problem at all in personal construct theory being subsumed under the label constructivist." But then on the next page, "If personal construct theory is allowed to be subsumed under the umbrella of constructivism, as if it were nothing but constructivist, Kelly's philosophy may well survive, but his theory will sink without trace. Repeating this view in a later publication, she added that the main problem is that many of the main supporters of the constructivist umbrella are also personal construct theorists. She later modified her views on constructivism somewhat, writing that, "I thought the constructivist movement might result in Kelly's psychological theory being lost sight of, but I now think that unlikely. It's now clear to me that the constructivist movement and interest in qualitative methods have paved the way for a much wider acceptance of PCP, and I see no reason why they will not continue to be accepted and used." Fay's initial reaction to the prospect of the theory that had become her way of life being lost without trace can clearly be construed in terms of Kelly's notions of threat and anxiety. But she was not altogether accepting of John Ruskin's attempt to do just that. Indeed, this appeared to revive her concern about whether constructivist philosophers will take attention away from PCP. And she wrote in 2007 that it's certainly an issue that is not going away. To be regarded as being threatened by the prospect of reconstruing of aspects of one's theory would itself likely be threatening to a personal construct theorist. As Fay wrote in her exploration of Threaten the Scientist, contradictory information or facts are no threat in themselves to the constructive alternativist. They merely provide grounds for reconstruction and further experimentation. But for the accumulative fragmentalist, it could mean a major revision of their whole scientific way of life and theoretical base. To be threatened by the potential demise of one's favoured theory could therefore imply that one is really an accumulative fragmentalist, a mere gatherer of facts. Given that she acknowledged that her perspective on scientific inquiry had changed radically, to view herself in such a way might have been doubly threatening to Fay, in terms of Landfield's view that one is threatened by the prospect of a reversion to a previous self that one has outgrown. Unlike the accumulative fragmentalist, a true constructive alternativist, heeding Kelly's dictum that a good psychological theory should be ultimately expendable, would paradoxically surely welcome and be validated by invalidation or reconstruction of their theory. However, if George Kelly were to be, as I suspect he is, looking down on us here, would he really be cursing that the range of convenience of his theory is still being extended, and that the theory has therefore not become expendable? Or might he have a sneaking smile of satisfaction? Fay's concern about the constructivism issue can be construed in terms of the possible superordinacy in her system of a construct concerning being subsumed versus subsuming. Apparent in some of her writings is a concern that the individual may have their dreams and idiosyncrasies quashed by being submerged in a faceless organization. One way of avoiding being subsumed is to do the subsuming, and one of Fay's most famous, or for some infamous, invitations to extend the range of convenience of PCP by subsuming another approach was in her opening address in 1977 to the first meeting to be labelled an International Congress on Personal Construct Psychology. This was around the time of the cognitive revolution in psychology, and Fay exhorted us that if behaviour therapy is up for grabs, we should be in there doing the grabbing. She went on to caution that we must not allow personal construct psychology to be incorporated within existing psychological frameworks. If we had to, we must do the incorporating. Indeed, her ambitions were even more expansive than to subsume behaviour therapy, since she went on to say, we are making a takeover bid for the discipline of psychology. Would that we'd listened to her then and followed her advice. Instead, rather than PCP subsuming behaviour therapy,